Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming out. My name is Shad Morona, and this is a real honor for me to have the opportunity to introduce our first of three presidential plenary addresses here at the ASC conference this year. I'm looking down at actually one of my program chairs is looking at me, the other one is not looking at me. Hello, Jamie Fader and Jill McCorkle. And I had the real privilege of coming up with this conference's theme, which is Reckoning with the Past, Reimagining a Future for Criminology. And we tried to come up with presidential plenaries and the final president's address at the end that would address this issue, encouraging us to look backward at successes and mistakes in the field, but then also look forward in terms of a new way of doing and being criminology. So I encourage you to check out the panels each day. They'll all be in this room at this time, at 12:30, and this salon. Tomorrow, I think, is mass incarceration, the 50th anniversary, and then Friday we're looking at the not uncontroversial issue of police violence in urban America today. But we really thought that the topic here today is the perfect way to start this conversation about reckoning with the past and reimagining our future. I was a student many years ago, obviously, of Alden Morris at Northwestern, and Morris, as you will know, is the author of the book Scholar Denied, W.E.B. Du Bois and the Birth of Modern Sociology, that seeks to rewrite the history of sociology to acknowledge the primacy of Du Bois's work. And there's a number of scholars on this panel here today who have been doing the same for criminology for many years now. And I'm delighted that the ASC, for the first time, is the first time in an elaborate setting like this, at least in a presidential plenary, is going to take a moment to have the same conversation in our field. So I will say no more except that I'm incredibly delighted to have had the help of our president-elect, our future president of the American Society of Criminology, who has done all of the work in organizing this panel and is become a great friend over the last few months and is going to be your host the rest of this session.
Hello and good afternoon. My name is Catherine Russell Brown, and I'm excited to be the moderator for today's panel. And I think it's notable, given that we're talking about the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, that we are just a stone's throw away from what was the 7th Ward and what was the base of his phenomenal work, the Philadelphia Negro. So what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce each of the panelists all at once, and then we will hear from each of them, and then we will engage in a discussion among the panel members, and then open it up to hear what your questions, comments, thoughts are. So we put together a great panel to discuss Du Bois's criminological work, and some of this discussion will include considerations of his foundational contributions, which were a precursor to the Chicago Schools social disorganization theory, and also how Du Bois's scholarship on neighborhoods, crime, and race was anchored in a systemic analysis and tied to his work on social disharmony. So this work expanded the criminological canon, and it is our hope, and as part of our discussion, that we will talk about ways in which we can continue to, and more broadly, make sure that Du Bois's work is part of the work that we do. So let me first introduce Dr. Sean Gabadon. Dr. Gabadon is a distinguished professor of criminal justice at Penn State Harrisburg. He received his doctorate in criminology from Indiana University of Pennsylvania. He has served as a fellow at Harvard's W.E.B. Du Bois Institute for African and African American Research. Professor Gabadon is the author of more than 100 scholarly publications, including more than 75 peer-reviewed articles and 13 books. His most recent books include the co-authored Shopping While Black, Consumer Racial Profiling in America, Criminological Perspectives on Race and Crime, and the co-authored book Race, Ethnicity, Crime, and Justice, an International Dilemma. Professor Gabadon has received numerous awards, including being named an ACJS Fellow, and in 2020, he was identified as the 24th most influential criminologist in the world. Now I'd like to introduce Rose Worth. Rose Worth is a, should I put the S on there? Should I? Yeah, okay, I'm gonna make sure. Is a PhD candidate in sociology at Northwestern University. And before pursuing a PhD, she worked for 4 years as a research analyst for RTI International, where she joined several nationwide evaluations. This work brought her to graduate school, where she researches urban public policy and violence, studying the people, organizations, and networks trying to address racial and social inequality in the U.S., in U.S. cities. Rose is known for working hand in hand with grassroots and community partners, and in the words of one of her collaborators, for blowing up what it means to be a researcher. Her work is published in the Journal of Social Problems and the Howard Journal of Crime and Justice, among others. Rose is currently working on her dissertation, a mixed methods examination of national conversations around public safety, policy, and racial justice, and what happened when one Midwestern progressive city and one Southern progressive city set out to reimagine public safety. Dr. Rory Kramer is Associate Professor of Sociology and Criminology at Villanova. His research focuses on racial inequality in the U.S. through institutions of social mobility or exclusion. His research has been published in journals including the American Journal of Sociology, the Du Bois Review, the Annual Review of Criminology, and Sociology of Race and Ethnicity. His current research is along 2 tracks. One, building on his recent co-authored book, Young, Gifted, and Diverse. He is a co-PI for a project interviewing a diverse sample of graduates of elite colleges and universities who have participated in the National Longitudinal Survey of Freshmen while in college. His second line of research focuses on understanding the latent harms of policing, especially police violence and use of force, and theorizing such violence as a purposeful function of the institution of policing. Okay? I want to note that we had initially hoped to have Dr. Hillary Potter on this panel. Unfortunately, she was unable to join us, but we're now ready to go. Dr. Gabadon?
Good afternoon. Well, first I'd like to thank Catherine for putting together the panel and Shad for working on this and realizing the significance of this, especially since we're in Philadelphia. As Catherine said, this is where the Philadelphia Negro was done, and I think there's something to be said about doing it here, as well as thinking about future panels actually engaging the work, okay? So I'll talk about that at the end. My presentation is sort of reflective, because I've been talking about this for a while. Some of you who have come to my presentations in the past, you may hear some of this. I've heard some of this before, but some of it is new. So there are some additional insights that I think will be useful. The first thing to think about is, who are we talking about, right? So it's always good to have a picture. That's Du Bois there. There, he's at Atlanta University. It's important for us to kind of understand that not only did he do significant work here, he did significant work in the South in the late 1800s and the early 20th century, which I think is important to understand as well. Okay, here's my outline. I'm going to just do a quick introduction. Why Philadelphia is a fitting place to do this. My interest in Du Bois interested in crime and justice. You know, most people just think of him as a sociologist or an activist. The Philadelphia Negro, I'll talk a little bit about that. Du Bois on Black criminology in Atlanta a few years ago, we had a nice panel talking about that, so I have some of those insights there. But Du Bois' exclusion from criminology is something that I think we really need to talk about, because the field is just at a place where it is time, it's long past time to make the recognition of his work. Okay, so my interest in Du Bois spans 30 years. Okay, I started my doctoral studies in 1993 at IUP. Prior to that, going to IUP, I became very interested in Black history. Many of us go to college and we learn nothing about Black history, or not much about it, especially in predominantly white institutions. So I did some self-study, and I had somebody that I used to go to in a bookstore in College Park, Maryland, and he used to feed me books, and one week he fed me The Souls of Black Folk. And I read that book, and I just was stunned how relevant it was to our field and how relevant it was to the Black experience at that time. After doing that, I went to graduate school, and he fed me more books, but when I got to graduate school, I really started to engage some of Du Bois' sociological works. I really wanted to study him. I had to find a way to do that, so I talked to all of my professors at IUP, and they said, yes, I could do a paper. I had an ethics course. I did a paper on the ethics of exclusion. I had a sociology, sort of a theoretical course. I did a paper on Du Bois' contribution. So throughout my time there, I did little pieces till I got to a point where I said, you know, there is so much work here that I could do a dissertation on this. And in most departments, there's a split. There's the empiricists, and there are the people that, you know, say, well, that other stuff isn't real research. So that split happened, but I still was able to do the project. Timothy Austin was my dissertation supervisor, said, let's do it. So we did this project in terms of coming up with a way to actually put it in dissertation form. And even though it was done, I remember the resistance among some of the other faculty said, Sean, in a sense, you're too good to do a project like this. You need to do something more quantitative. And I also recall, one thing I'll point out as well is that during that time, not long after I left, I decided I wanted to come back. But because of that split in the department, I wasn't able to go back to IUP because they didn't see that project as something that they felt would bear the fruit necessary to be successful there as a faculty member. So those type of things are important when you think about what students talk about today. There's still some of that resistance to these non-traditional projects that have an opportunity to advance the field. After I moved on from IUP, I published some work on Du Bois, but I had a strategy. This was a strategy. I'm always strategic, and I always have a plan. You can ask my wife, she's in the audience. I always have a plan. My plan was, I understood that there were two separate organizations who had overlapping interests. We had the ACJS and we have ASC, right? So I wanted to get the information to both segments of the sort of scholarly community. So I said, first, JCJE is a place to go. So I sent the article there, Dorothy Bracey, and I put the names there because these are the people that believed in the work. Dorothy Bracey worked with the articles that I sent. She sent them out. They got interesting reviews, I should say, but she kept on with it, saying, we're gonna get this piece published. And I published an article in 1996, an argument for the inclusion of W.E.B. Du Bois on race and crime. Oops. And then I later published an article talking about Du Bois' Atlanta school and how his Atlanta school predated the Chicago school. Then I said, well, how am I going to get to ASC? Criminology is not going to publish an article on Du Bois. So I said, let me think about publishing an essay in the Criminologist, probably the most read document in the ASC membership. So I contacted Miriam DeLone, who was the editor at the time, and she said, you know what, we're going to do a two-part series. So for 2 issues of the Criminology back to back, there were articles related to Du Bois. And another article I had looked at Du Bois's pioneering crime poll he did in 1904. Again, people don't think of the magnitude of the research, but he actually did a crime poll, a statewide crime poll that involved youth, it involved adults, it involved prominent people, both from the white and the black community. Tried to get that published in a criminal justice journal, but they just didn't see the relevance, and they didn't connect with that work. Then I published a book, and then obviously in 2019, I published a paper on Du Bois being the pioneer of black criminology. After that, in that article, I said I would never publish another piece on this topic, because what happens is when you become the expert on something like this, that's such a niche, basically you're publishing the same things over. I felt it was important for me to stop publishing and have other people publish. So people will contact me to publish. No, I'm not going to do that. And they found other people. So sometimes, even though you're a specialist in the area, the way to move the field forward in that particular area is to actually decline publications. And there you have the 2 pieces, the criminologist. The first piece looked at essentially just a general overview of his work. The second piece actually did a comparison of Du Bois's 1901 article on the convict lease system to William Chambliss's article looking at vagrancy during the Black Death, and just showed sort of the similar analyses of that, but showing the differences of how Du Bois's publications at the turn of the century, talking about stuff going on in the South, was an interesting and pioneering and bold statement to make, especially during those times in the South. Okay, so that's kind of my background studying, but why would Du Bois have an interest in this? In my early study of his work, and I've pretty much gone through everything that he's published, his early correspondence talks about personal experiences being a correspondent for a newspaper, the New York Globe, where he talks about the need for looking at some of the vices that were going on in the black community. And he also had an encounter with the criminal justice system himself, in the juvenile justice system, where he and his friends engaged in some mischief in Great Barrington, where they stole some grapes from a vineyard, a prominent person's vineyard, and that person wanted to actually press charges, but he was actually saved by his principal, who took a personal interest in him and actually got him out of that. So he thought about this. He reflected on this as an autobiography. So he had personal experiences, just like many criminologists today get into the field because of their personal experiences. Obviously, you can see here he had outstanding training. It's important to talk about that because, unfortunately, the way these things work typically is that, they'll say, well, where was he trained? What's his background? He had the most exquisite training at the time. He went to Europe. He went to the top school in the University of Berlin. He was a student with Max Weber, and he studied at the Historical School of Economics. And even though he wanted to get his PhD at the University of Berlin, his funding was cut because the funder said, what would a black man in the United States do with a PhD from the University of Berlin? He came back and continued his studies at Harvard and got his PhD as the first African-American to get one in history there. He did start his lifelong interest in crime and justice with his dissertation. Most people, if you don't engage him substantively, you won't see that his first major work was actually on crime, okay? It was the suppression of the African slave trade to the United States of America. What Du Bois did, he analyzed all of the statutes in the America related to the suppression of the slave trade, and he analyzed like who was being convicted of these type of things, who were involved, and what he noticed was that nobody was being convicted. After all international laws, all of these things, nobody was actually paying any consequences for this. And he talked about that in this particular book. So if you look at it, as I say on there, it's really the first piece on white crime and organized white crime. But if you don't critically read it, you'll just pass it over and just think of it as just, a dissertation. That's not important. It's a very important piece. For the Philadelphia Negro, and again, I'm just going to pass through some things that I think are important. Du Bois recognized the double consciousness of being a black social scientist. I, today, deal with that. Black scholars and other minority scholars, and we deal with this in some regard, in some shape or form. His intent was on producing serious scholarly work, but if you look at people talking about his work back then, they were still suspicious of a black man studying black people, as if he could not be an objective observer of this particular kind of situation. And in a sense, he understood he couldn't be totally detached, but that doesn't mean he couldn't do good science. As we know, those of us who have read it, he's produced a classic urban ethnography of the black community here in Philadelphia. It's widely recognized among sociologists, at least at this stage, that it's the first urban ethnography in a major city. Pretty much, if you look at the book and how it's done, the approach is just superlative in terms of the methodological approach. All you have to do is read the first chapter that looks at his methods, and you will just be astounded of what he did at the turn of the century. He did not view mere tabulations of statistics as sufficient. He actually lived in the 7th Ward for almost a year, okay? This was not just what we do today. We go find statistics, sometimes and just try to get a sense of what's going on through statistics. He actually had statistics, plus he actually lived there, and talks about his autobiography of he and his wife going under the bed when they hear gunshots in the streets out where he lived. So a door-to-door canvass of the 7th Ward, 8 different survey schedules, family schedules, home schedules, street schedules, alley schedules. He triangulated his research methods. We would consider this a major piece of work today in 2023, but he did this in 1899, in the late 1800s. The entire book discusses crime throughout. If we want to be lazy about it, we would just go to the chapter on crime. But if you want to be serious about it, you would actually read the entire book, just like we would read any other treaty today that deals with the subject to this magnitude. He provided multiple reasons for high involvement of blacks in the Philadelphia justice system. He talked about, how the movement of, the slave trade and the American slave system and how that impacted on people in Philadelphia, the migration. He talks about criminal classes. He gets into racial discrimination throughout the book, talking about employment discrimination, discrimination in the justice system. There is nothing that's not covered in this particular work. But again, the book is available. It has been for over 100 years. Don't take my word for it, okay? He did an analysis of incarcerated criminals. So he actually got the statistics and analyzed them. And these are the findings. They were young. Does that sound familiar? They were male. Does that sound familiar? They were single. Does that sound familiar? They were under 30. Does that sound familiar? He talked about recidivism. He talked about the criminal class being responsible for the mass of criminals. So what he understood was that was a small group of blacks were committing the majority of the crimes. Does that sound familiar? Du Bois's, in terms of black criminology and him creating a program that was race-centered, it provides foundational support for black criminology. He was intent on studying the problem firsthand, not simply through the detached lens of official statistics. He relied on the inductive approach. It was largely devoid of comparisons to whites, and if you look at his 1898 Annals publication talking about the study of Negro problems, you'll see him talking about this notion that we're comparing whites to blacks. These comparisons just don't make sense, given the situation of the two. He developed a highly regarded program at Atlanta University. I published an article on the Atlanta School in 1999, and as I recall, I think Catherine passed it on to somebody named Earl Wright or told him about it. and Earl Wright, who's a sociologist, have published books on this particular topic showing how this preceded the Atlanta school. Preceded the Chicago school. And I'll talk about that a little bit at the end. The other thing is, quick couple of things. Du Bois was not an apologist for crime in the black community. So that means, he understood there were things that we really needed to address. So many of his publications at Atlanta University and otherwise talked about things that black people need to do, but he also talked about things that white people needed to do to solve some of these problems. And as you can see, I'll just go back. Some of these things, again, if you look at them, for suggestions for African Americans, proper home training, accept deployment over crime, things like this are things we're actually still talking about. He gave us a foundation early on. In terms of suggestions for whites, things today that we're still talking about. Du Bois would encourage researchers of all racial ethnic backgrounds to work within the black criminology paradigm. Today, he collaborated with whites. He had, at his Atlanta University conferences, he had all of the top people. Franz Boas came, Max Weber came. You can name all the people that came to Atlanta, to his school, to see what they were doing and also present and give presentations on their research. So again, it wasn't like it was just some program that was a passing in the night. It was a major research program that he put together with the most minimal funding at the time. I was asked to put together some of the key criminological writings, and I have some handouts if you want there, but I'm just going to go through some of these. The study of Negro problems in 1898, he outlined his program of how to study the black population at the time. He talked about historical investigation, statistical investigation, anthropological investigation, not in a Du Boisian sense, but just to see what differences were between the groups. And he talked about sociological investigation. Those four things is what he said were necessary to get a full grasp of the issues. In there, he talks about the dire need for serious studies on crime. Right? He comes out and plainly says, crime is one of the areas, because of the emotions, the passions, over time, the previous research was just not sufficient. So he waited, he said, the time is now for an important study. Obviously, we talked about the Philadelphia Negro. In 1899, in the Independent, he published a small article on Negro and crime and outlined various causes of crime. The 1901 article, The Spawn of Slavery, is just an absolute classic. And I've published a few readers, and 3 readers, I think, I've republished this article. It analyzes the convict lease system, and most people don't really understand what that system was. It was a system where the government and private entity worked together to control the labor of blacks who were moving out of the slave era. And he just talks about how that period was so important in what happened in terms of blacks having to, being brought into the criminal justice system and populating the prisons, and also just, in terms of impeding their progress after the Reconstruction, during the Reconstruction period and thereafter. It's just an important article that I think we should all have some sense of and read. The Laboratory in Sociology at Atlanta University. We talk about this today, and we talk about it in terms of the Chicago school. They say, well, there was just a laboratory in Chicago, and it was. And I think the one thing I'll say here is, we do not diminish what the Chicago school did by also acknowledging what the Atlanta school did. I think there's like this thing that there's a zero-sum game. If we say Atlanta was so good that Chicago is so bad, that's not what it is. It's that there was something existing there prior to that, 20 to 30 years before Chicago even came about. There was something there. Okay, Some Notes on Negro Crime. This is actually an edited volume where they had a conference every year. Atlanta had a conference, Atlanta University had a conference, and this year it was on crime. And several people contributed to this, Monroe Work, other scholars, but Du Bois had his students do a crime poll that's in that particular publication. And I highlight that in one of my publications that focuses on that, how it was such a pioneering crime poll. And in that poll, he found something that we call the racial divide today in terms of public opinion. Moral Manuals among Negro Americans, again, another publication devoted to crime and unrelated topics. And then in The Crisis was a magazine attached to the NAACP. When Du Bois left Atlanta University, he went to The Crisis. And just think of it like this: if you have the preeminent scholar who creates a magazine that's accessible to the larger public, and he provides his insights in there, those insights are very important. It was a document that almost every Black family would subscribe to, and there's the first issue of it. But throughout that document, you can get a gauge of not only the history of what's going on in American society, also his insights and the changing nature of his thoughts on crime over time. Okay, this is the one. How much am I doing on time? Okay. I'm getting close, okay. It's important for us to consider why he was excluded. Obviously, there was racism in the academy. At the time, there was gross racism in terms of obviously the feeling of Black inferiority. So if you have that wide sentiment, why would you think that the best research would be coming from a Black man in Atlanta, right? So, I mean, Alden Morris in his book, The Scholar Denied, talks about that. But the real reason why many people believe that Du Bois was sort of shut out was because of the Du Bois versus Booker T. Washington debate, okay? Booker T. Washington was very prominent at the time Du Bois was writing. And Robert Park was somebody who, according to Morris's reading of it, really didn't know what he wanted to do. So he took this appointment as Booker T. Washington's secretary, his ghostwriter. That's what he did for 7 years, okay? But during that time, he bought into the ideas of Booker T. Washington. So after he left that position and he headed to Chicago, there was no way that he was going to preach that Du Bois was producing the best research out there, or that his research was of consequence. So when he went to Chicago, all of their students were not trained to know much about Du Bois. The only people that really talked about Du Bois were the Black students who, just like today, seek out the work of Black scholars, okay? The University of Chicago was forming at the turn of the 20th century, and Du Bois was already producing classics. Albion Small, who founded the Chicago sociology department, he actually went to Germany as well to get his training. But those students, as I said, they just weren't being taught about Du Bois's works. They had to seek that out. The other thing is, Du Bois's Atlanta University, they didn't have PhD students. He had master's students, and they did great work, but he still didn't get to have those students go on, and some of them, and carry on his legacy. It was also known that he was very abrasive, and I would presume that I would be abrasive too if everything that you did was sort of not perceived as, quality with all that you've done and the training that you had. And he also had controversial political views. All right, and here's a flyer where he was actually charged by the Department of Justice. All right, I'll wrap it up here. Couple other things. He has had some recognition. He was included in the Key Thinkers in Criminology, 50 Key Thinkers. There are some articles, you can get that from me. And Western Society of Criminology, National Justice. In 2006, the ASA named its highest award after Du Bois, a Lifetime Achievement Award. And finally, I'll just say a couple of other things I'll skip through. And obviously, if anybody wants a PowerPoint, I'm more than happy to send it to you. Okay, final slide. Du Bois' work should be cited in every study related to communities and neighborhoods. Doctoral programs hold a key to this. I just share a correspondence that I had with Frank Cullen, who's a friend, colleague, and mentor in some ways. He sent me an email back in April of last year, and this is what it says quickly. Over the past several weeks, I have studied the Philadelphia Negro carefully and read the collateral literature. I used to think that Sean McKay's Juvenile Delinquency in Urban Areas was the greatest book in the field, given its scope and enduring impact, but it is clear that Du Bois's The Philadelphia Negro rivals the value and surpasses it in some ways. My point is that I should have listened to you 25 years ago and apologized for not doing so. My understanding of the field was impoverished by this oversight, but I hope to rectify this now. And I appreciated that email, right? We all make mistakes. We all overlook things, but he had the fortitude to say, you know what, Sean, I should have listened to you back then when you first started talking about this. I will say that it's important for the discipline not to do what I call in here perfunctory citations. We do that, yeah? We're like, okay, well, Du Bois, you need to read that. We need substantive engagement of his work. Finally, anybody know who that is before I go? It's not my father, it's not Du Bois, because I have pictures of Du Bois, black scholars in my office, and people always ask, is that your grandfather? You know, it's not. Anybody know who that is? No, okay. That is Felton Earls. He's a graduate of Howard University. He is the architect. He is the visionary of the Project on Human Development in Chicago, one of the major studies in criminology. I think we should know who he is. Maybe 100 years from now, we will know who he is, but we should know who he is. And I think at some point we should recognize that his vision created the project that many scholars in our field use that data set for articles. That was just a tidbit at the end there. Okay, thank you.
Right, well, before I begin, I just want to, working, can y'all hear me all right? All right, cool. I just want to say how honored I am to be on the panel with the three of you. And I also want to specifically thank one of my teachers who's been mentioned so far, Alden Morris. I can't really talk about Du Bois without talking about him. Alden, as well as Sean, have been lifting up Du Bois's work when so many people in the fields of criminology and sociology were telling them that his work wasn't scholarly or relevant. And I'm on this panel, hopefully as a member of a new generation of scholars who are being told a different and truer story about how our disciplines were formed, but without the work of Sean, Catherine, Alden, Rory, Hillary, I wouldn't be up on this stage today. So thank you. And to begin, I'm going to be focusing my short talk on Du Bois's theory of social disharmony, which I wrote a paper on in Social Problems, so I'm just going to touch on it briefly, but you can find it there. And before I go into what he says in that theory, I want to say when talking about Du Bois's work, we have to recognize the context in which he lived and wrote. So he was living in the time of Jim Crow, during the industrialization and urbanization of US cities, and during a time when white scholars were using the emergence of demographic and crime statistics to argue, or really, I guess, bolster their pre-existing beliefs that Black people were inferior and inherently criminal. And this was the predominant belief at the time, was that crime was a result of biological and racial traits. And through his many writings, but especially within the Philadelphia Negro, Du Bois defines crime as a social, not a biological phenomenon. And the Chicago School of Sociology, which again came about 15, 20, 30 years after Du Bois, largely gets the credit in retellings of criminology and sociology and social science history for this turn in criminological theory. But not only did Du Bois write this decades before the Chicago School, his theories emphasize that the social environment that creates crime, or what we call crime, stems from a system of racial and social exclusion. Du Bois called unequal social conditions in cities unjust. He did not see the social environment that caused crime as natural or inevitable, And you will see that this starkly contrasts with how the Chicago School wrote about the larger social and economic forces that shape cities and what distinguishes his work from their work. So if you'll indulge me, I'm going to go into a mini urban sociology lesson because I think that you can't really understand, given that Du Bois wrote this magnum opus, the sort of first big urban sociological study of a city, you can't really understand his theories on crime without understanding a little bit how he understood cities. So in his research for the Philadelphia Negro, as Sean was saying, Du Bois conducted extensive mapping, surveying, and ethnography in the 7th Ward, where a concentration of Philadelphia's Black residents lived at the time. And there's whole books about his mapping and his surveys and his charts, which if you're like a nerd about data visualization, you should definitely search those out. They're very cool to see. But he showed that the geography of US cities like Philadelphia had a visible racial and economic hierarchy that you could see just looking at the physical and social location of neighborhoods. And across those neighborhoods, residents had different access to resources and opportunities according to their race and class. And critically, he argued that these racialized geographies were the result of decisions by economic elites. People in power were upholding a social and economic system that enforced a strict racial hierarchy between the wealthy elite, white immigrants, and Black residents. And a couple of decades later, Park and Burgess, who were two prominent Chicago School sociologists, also conducted a spatial analysis of Chicago that went on to inform the work of Shaw and McKay, who wrote Juvenile Delinquency in Urban Areas, which is a canonical text for criminology. But Park and Burgess described cities as, they used a biological metaphor, as an organism that had a metabolism that could get out of balance. And when that metabolism got out of balance, you got these neighborhoods with concentrated poverty and disorder. But they explained that that was just part of the natural life cycle of cities, that organization and disorganization were to be expected in cities. So their theory of upward social mobility was that white migrants over time would move through different social zones in cities, eventually ending up in wealthy white neighborhoods. But because they viewed Black people as inherently inferior to white people, it was kind of besides the point that segregated Black enclaves did not really fit into that theory at all. So the point I'm making here is that for the majority of Chicago School scholars, the economic and social processes that shaped cities were just a natural part of the cycle of urban life. The segregation of Black Americans, in their eyes, was appropriate and expected. And when they were looking at what caused crime, they studied the social environment that was then internal to neighborhoods that they identified as being high in disorder. They weren't interested, or they sort of alluded to, yes, these larger social forces, but again, they weren't really interested in those forces that created hierarchy and inequality because they saw them as natural. And this point is crucial because understanding how the color line was shaping social and economic systems, and thus the daily life of Black Americans, was core to Du Bois's work, and core, therefore, to how he understood crime. So what I'm about to show you is one of the opening passages of the chapters in the Philadelphia Negro, where Du Bois continues to speak about, or begins to speak about crime. And from the beginning, he states his thesis that crime is caused by deep social forces. So he writes, "Crime is a phenomenon of organized social life and is the open rebellion of an individual against his social environment. Naturally, then, if men are suddenly transported from one environment to another, the result is lack of harmony with social surroundings, leading to crime." So this is a really mild statement about crime compared to how he talks about it in some of his later writings, but I want everyone to note the language of rebellion that he uses, because across several of his writings, he talks about crime as a rebellion or a revolt. And his writings on crime indict an unequal social environment for leading a minority of Black people to either commit crimes or get caught up in an unjust criminal legal system. And then, as Sean was saying, you can't just read the chapters that are talking about crime, because what he does then in the rest of the chapters in the book is goes into detail developing theories about that social environment that he said was leading to crime among Black Americans in Philadelphia. So the first big chapter after the chapter on crime, he goes into housing and rents and inequality in those areas, the segregation of Black residents, divides by social class, and then he spends a whole chapter on racial discrimination that Black Americans in Philadelphia faced in all areas of their life. Again, building that theory of social disharmony and injustice being the cause of crime. So what he lays out in this chapter is what I call his theory of social disharmony and racial injustice. So again, legacies of slavery and the failure of Reconstruction coincided with this mass migration of Black Americans to US cities, which led Black people in cities like Philadelphia to live in environments of social and economic exclusion, which he said fostered this crime and rebellion amongst those populations. And very briefly, to show the contrast with social disorganization theory, which was drawn out, again, primarily by Shaw and McKay, their work doesn't focus on social and racial inequality at all. Again, they don't see the formation of low-income, racially segregated neighborhoods with limited access as concerning in and of itself. They were concerned with the internal dynamics of those neighborhoods and the breakdown of social control. So social disorganization is a very cultural theory, and it's looking how the social environment and that lack of enforcement of social norms leads to the cultural transmission of criminal behavior amongst populations. So again, social disorganization and social disharmony theory do not necessarily contradict one another. I would argue that Du Bois's theory is an encompassing theory of how the social environment leads to crime, but they do lead to very different solutions to crime. Shaw and McKay created the Chicago Area Project, which was all about fostering leadership within socially disorganized neighborhoods in order to prevent crime. And a lot of crime prevention strategies today owe their origins to Shaw and McKay's work. But Du Bois was focused on addressing the social inequality that he saw as critical to causing crime and other social problems. So the quote I'm about to show speaks to that, but also speaks to another point that I don't really have time to elaborate on right now, but a point that I make in the paper. Because it's important to acknowledge that Du Bois understood crime as a social construct. He wrote extensively about the convict lease system, about the injustices that he saw in the criminal legal system, and was explicit that what was considered criminal for white Americans and Black Americans was not the same thing. So this quote shows how Du Bois weaves together his critical analysis and his views on what caused crime. So, quote, "If slavery, the convict lease system, the traffic in criminal labor, and the lack of juvenile reformatories, together with the unfortunate discrimination and prejudice in other walks of life, have led to that sort of social protest and revolt which we call crime, then we must look for remedy in the sane reform of these wrong social conditions, and not in intimidation, savagery, or the legalized slavery of men." And as I was revisiting his work and my paper for this panel, I was thinking about the implications of his work for the field of criminology, and three kind of main takeaways came to me. First, there needs to be a recognition across criminology that racism and social and economic oppression fundamentally shape our lives, who gets harmed, and what we call crime. And that those structural conditions are not abstract, but the result of real people and institutions making decisions. Second, we need to continue to reckon as a field that traditionally serves the interests of the criminal legal system with the role that the criminal legal system has played in oppressing Black and brown communities. And finally, I think that revisiting Du Bois's work calls us to center the work of Black criminologists and others inside and outside of the academy who've established a robust tradition of work that follows in the footsteps of Du Bois. Some of these people are up on this panel, some of these people are in this room. And for those of us who are trying to work in that tradition, we should continue to be loud, to shift the mainstream where we can, and to create new spaces where we cannot. And that is an approach that mirrors the strategies that Du Bois had to take throughout his career. So thank you. I'm looking forward to our discussion and your questions.
My slides aren't nearly as pretty anyway. Terrible at graphic presentation. That's fine. First, thank you for having me on this panel. Thank you for inviting me, ASC, Jill, Jamie, Chad, Catherine, for hosting. And especially with Sean on the panel, I don't want to and didn't plan to try to convince you Du Bois was as phenomenal a scholar as he was, because I knew Sean would do that better than I could. Sean, Alden, Eli, Earl, Takufu, many others have shown how advanced Du Bois was across many fields. Right? Criminology is not alone in owing so much to Du Bois, and criminology is also not alone in doing a terrible job of acknowledging that. As someone who came from sociology, take heart. You aren't alone in being way behind by about 125 years. So instead, what I wanted to do, and I take some of this from Du Bois's preface to Black Reconstruction. It's a short one-page preface. I'm not going to quote it because I don't have it in front of me. But in effect, he says, if you don't accept the fundamental truth that Black people are equal and full human beings to everyone else, then you're not going to like my book. Too bad. I'm not going to convince you. So similarly, inspired by that, if you don't accept the truth that Du Bois was a scholar beyond his time, way ahead of where everyone basically across multiple fields was at his time, and that we should have been listening to him all of this time, you're not going to like what I have to say. And I think there's been a lot of great work, but as Sean said, he was doing this work in the 90s, pointing out how far ahead Du Bois was. Eli Anderson had the Philadelphia Negro republished at 100 years. This is 125 years, and we're still doing this. We're still doing the work of convincing people Du Bois was that far ahead. And I'm a little tired of it. As a reader, as a reviewer, as a scholar, can't we do even better than that? And I take that from Moon-Kee Jung's argument about Black Reconstruction, that we've had the scholars who have made the case that Du Bois is the center of kind of American social sciences, writ large, including criminology. And we saw phenomenal examples of that in the prior two presentations. And basically, it's become almost performative. Like the perfunctory citations you said, it's become performative to say, well, I'm going to write the piece that says Du Bois already said this. Okay, what if we started from the principle, Du Bois probably already said this? In effect. It is time, I'd argue, to stand on the shoulders of giants, not only Du Bois, but the scholars, especially the Black scholars, who have been yelling at us to listen to them and to listen to him for years. And then to be able to see even more and even further than what Du Bois could see 125 years ago, working with very little budget and basically building a field from scratch. As Sean notes, it's not just tables of statistics. And in criminology, I think we have an interesting case here because, as Rose and Sean both really powerfully pointed out, if you read just the chapter on crime, you don't get Du Bois's argument. And in fact, the chapter on crime is probably the chapter where he is the most silent as an analyst. The analysis is elsewhere. The crime chapter is copies of newspaper reports, tables of statistics, and an occasional reference to his own thoughts. But most of that thought comes somewhere else. And I think they point out that implicitly what he's saying is to look only at crime is to have too myopic a view. And so you need to look beyond crime. And so criminology needs to take that seriously. And broadly, I'm also most excited across multiple fields by the work that's integrating Du Bois into not just, hey, he did this, we can say we're doing a Du Boisian style, but also what are the contemporary critiques and concerns and struggles that we're having as scholars, right? So I mentioned Jung's piece on Black Reconstruction that argued that actually there's a problem in what I would say is Du Bois's best work, personally at least, in that he doesn't quite understand how a worker could be both labor and capital at the same time, and couldn't step outside of his kind of quasi-Marxist analytic view in that piece. Hartman takes Du Bois to task a little bit about the Philadelphia Negro, saying that, yeah, he did amazing stuff for what he could do, but there were people that were not willing to talk to him for understandable reasons. Because it was 1898, he had only been there for a year, he had this set of surveys, he was a very Victorian in dress and style and an abrasive personality scholar. And so he didn't see some of the alternative forms of family that were being built in the 7th Ward, especially by young women who were migrants from the South, and that version of life wasn't seen. Tukufu Zuberi argues that one of the few weaknesses of the Philadelphia Negro, and it sounds like I'm critiquing Du Bois, and that's why I started with that preface, because this is critique from love. This is critique from being able to see how much he had done and saying, now I can do even more because I can rest on that shoulder. Tukufu Zuberi says he had still this assimilationist impulse when he was writing the Philadelphia Negro. And it's understandable. You just got a PhD from Harvard. You just got hired by Penn to do this huge study. You are a rising young star. And then what happens to his career and his scholarship? But at the time, that assimilationist strength had him analyzing crime as kind of this momentary shift as long as Black people were integrated into white society. And it's later Du Bois where he critiques the idea that that is something that could be so simple or something that whiteness would ever perpetuate or accept. So I tried in work that I'll be presenting in more detail later, 3:30 if you're interested. I try to argue that we should use Du Bois as the starting point to what I had been calling, and probably could rework the title, especially an anti-sociology of crime, because an anti-criminology of crime just doesn't roll off the tongue quite as well. That crime and the criminal, since Jim Crow as a time, became the replacement for the antisocial category that Jung argues Du Bois needed to add to his analysis of Black Reconstruction in thinking through the Jim Crow era. And that in thinking about crime as the antisocial category rather than a social problem, but the category upon which we compare ourselves to justify our own behaviors as the social, that our data and analysis that comes from the system that is designed to identify crime, to capture it, to judge it, is data that will not lead us out of that problem. And so, to me, a Du Boisian criminology gets to say, yeah, he did all this, so now we get to do even more, and even more radical, because as Du Bois himself grew in his scholarship over time, he started doing that same move, of saying, well, now that I've already done this, I can go a step further. So I would hope that because you've watched other fields start the process of being like, ooh, Du Bois did this, and then 10 or 15 or 20 years later, the next generation of scholars said, and now we can do even more, that maybe you can not skip that step, but speed up that process and do them together in criminology. And I look forward to that work getting done, because you can cite Sean. You don't have to redo Sean's work, just cite him. So with that, again, 3:30 if you want to hear the details of the data argument.
Those were fantastic presentations, and given the time, we now want to open up for Q&A, and hopefully you have some questions, comments, thoughts, and while we're waiting for people to come up to the microphone, please, because this is being recorded, I'll throw out a question to the panel. And so listening to everyone's presentation and thinking about ways to engage with and to get more people, get more information out there about Du Bois's work, I'm wondering what you think are some things we might be able to do, and just in thinking about how we kind of uplift Du Bois, for the most part, professors teach what they learned, right? And so there has to be some way to create some kind of interruption in the status quo. And I just did a cursory look online to see what courses are offered on Du Bois. Less than a handful. Very few courses devoted to Du Bois's scholarship are offered in graduate schools or undergraduate programs. So, I mean, I think one of the first things that can happen is to push for having courses that are devoted to examining criminological aspects of Du Bois's work, or the overlap that addresses crim. So just wanted to see if anyone had any thoughts on how we might move this conversation forward so we're not in 10 years having the same conversation again.
I'll just start. It's really doctoral programs. That's really where this actually starts, right? So you have a doctoral program, you have doctoral reading lists, you have doctoral comps. All of those things are where this happens. If those names or those people that you think should be on there aren't on there, if Du Bois's name is on there, they're not going to read those. So have those readings. If you don't discuss it in class, it's not going to happen. The other thing I'll say is there are significant edited books in the field. If there is not an excerpt from Du Bois's book, it's just not important. And I'll give you an example. I'm working with someone, and we were just talking, and he said, "Well, I had to read this paper that you published in his doctoral program." And I was like, "Well, how did you come across it?" He's like, "Because it was in a reader," right? So those type of things are so crucial. I mean, textbooks, edited volumes, and those doctoral reading lists, if those don't get altered, nothing will change, because that's the way it happens. I don't expect people who have been in the field for 30, 40 years to actually read Du Bois. It's just not going to happen. It's just the way it works. People have already sort of set their minds on what they see as the classics, and for that to change, I mean, it's very difficult. So you have to have a new generation in terms of those doctoral reading lists and those people who are actually consuming those lists to change the field.
Great. Since we have a few people in the queue, come on up. If you don't mind saying your name. I can't read your badge from here, I'm sorry. Are we? It doesn't feel like it's on. Are you able to hear?
Hello?
Yeah.
Hey, there we go. My name is Aaron Mallory. I'm first year PhD student studying criminal justice at the University of Cincinnati. And so I learned more. So there's been like this debate between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. And oftentimes, I would find myself getting caught up in these conversations. And I started to really value and understand Du Bois after the Philadelphia Negro, and then after reading his autobiography, where, both esteemed great black men contribute significantly after, like kind of just this post-1800, 1900 perspective. But my thoughts are, like, the work around the Philadelphia Negro, that's what's done very well, I feel like could be replicated and done again within a lot of inner city communities, and really just looking at from an ethnographical perspective of understanding kind of these challenges, and then thinking about how we can create interventions to address what the research is saying. And so I guess my question is, how do we think about creating some type of institutions that are designed to take what Du Bois was creating, what he wrote in his writings, and particularly around the Philadelphia Negro, and kind of create these spaces where it can be a catalyst to, again, learn more about the nuances when we talk about inner city challenges that are taking place, but then also thinking about the practical side of also using the research to solve these problems and coming up with solutions to that. So if that makes sense, just something that I've been thinking about as I explore, and valuing what Du Bois has contributed to the culture.
Yeah, praxis, right? Do someone want to jump in?
I think one of the things that I take from it is to follow Du Bois, where he was always of the academy, but not in the academy, right? If your entire ethos is the research side of things, then that's not actually Du Boisian. He was never just research, and it was always a tension within his career when he would jump between these things, and people said, "Why were you doing this when you should have been doing that?" or whatever the case may be. But if your research can be purely research and have no impact outside of the field, then it's not Du Boisian. And so if the institution is only one, then it's not Du Boisian. And the same is true if it's only impacting a specific community or a specific problem. Like, that's great. I love people who can do that. But that's not fully Du Boisian if it's not connected to research that tells us something new about how things work. And so seeing that the two are always together and always complementary, and that this idea that there's a friction between the two is actually convenient for people who are non-Du Boisian, I think is the best way I like to think about it. That's not very practical, but it helps me at least as I think through a decision about what's the next thing I do.
Yeah, I think of part of the answer to your question is I feel like there has been an absence of Du Bois in the mainstream of criminology, but there are plenty of ethnographies and Black and non-Black criminologists who have sought out his work, and it's at the margins. But I start there in that, I think to the point that Rory was making, I think there are people who have been calling for Du Bois for years. So we don't have to start building from scratch off of the Philadelphia Negro. We can start looking at Catherine's work and Hillary's work, who's not here, and then Elijah Anderson and so many other people who have done these deep ethnographies of Black communities and people who are thinking about praxis. And if you also look at someone like, Jane Addams, who was like very deeply engaged in praxis in Chicago and was also excluded from the histories of sociology and criminology because of her dedication to praxis. I think there are these other examples out there, and I'm gonna kind of veer in my answer a little bit and go back to the question that you just asked, Catherine, because you're a graduate student and I'm also a graduate student. I think part of the social change that we're talking about can come from graduate students. I've seen my fellow graduate students go into classes and say like, hey, why isn't there Du Bois on this curriculum? Why aren't there more Black scholars on your reading list? And like thinking like an organizer, if you get, all the graduate students in your department to sign a letter, send it to your department saying, hey, we need to think our curriculum, they probably won't like that, but it can lead to change. And I think being in a department, which I think Shad can attest to with Alden Morris, like being in a department with Alden Morris, and I'm sure I hope that this is also true of your colleague, Sean, it forced them to engage in his scholarship and change the curriculum that I was taught. I got taught Du Bois, not just in a class specifically on Du Bois, but in my classic theory class and my class on neighborhoods and crime. And that's, the result of Alden's work. But I think in a place, not every department is gonna have a Sean and not every department is gonna have an Alden. So I think in that sort of, to what Sean was saying, that professors who are, 30, 40 years into their career and gonna wanna change things, I think we can be troublesome as graduate students and push the field to change as well.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the panel. I'm Brendan McQuaid, the chair of the Criminology Department at the University of Southern Maine. I was wondering if the panel could talk a bit more about Du Bois's controversial political views. I'm sure you know, in 1961, late in his life, he joined the Communist Party and had a rather provocative public statement about that. So anti-communism was a kind of major factor in his marginalization in many academic disciplines. So I think in the spirit of like substantive engagement with the whole of Du Bois's work, it seems like a lot of the recent reappropriation of Du Bois has been an attempt to kind of incorporate him into a liberal reformist sociology or criminology. And I wonder if that's like honest to where he ended up. Like I look at the way Du Bois is written about in the journal Social Justice, and I would think that Du Bois would be more interested in abolishing the field of criminology than being appropriated as one of its founding fathers. Thank you.
Take it first.
Do I ever? Actually, I really appreciate the question.
No, go ahead. No, whatever.
And then you can go. Yeah.
Oh, Sean, okay. So I'll let you deal with should he be in criminology or does he want to abolish criminology as a sociologist? I'm just going to be like, yeah, I'm a sociologist. You're right that he ended up further left than he started. And any scholarship that doesn't acknowledge that is doing him a disservice and doing scholarship a disservice. Why that happened is an interesting thing that we don't have a full session of time for, but it's worth looking. It's worth knowing. Oh my God, I just blanked on what I was going to say. So he ended up further left than he started. And it's a lot, what's happening now is a lot like what a new book by Hajar Yazida wrote about Martin Luther King and how he has been appropriated, right? And everyone says the color of the content of your character, not the color of your skin, and forgets all of the actual radical politics behind King. Like the same thing is at risk of happening with Du Bois. And that's part of those, like, look, Du Bois did it first that I don't really love, is because sometimes that has to focus on like an early Du Bois, because that's the most kind of traditionally academic Du Bois. And there's good in that, but then you miss that he argues in like Black Reconstruction in the world in Africa that effectively dominance by white people over Black people has defined the modern world, period. And makes a very radical argument about what a Marxist viewpoint should be in Black Reconstruction and how to actually incorporate race and class in a way that racial capitalism is still arguing and trying to figure out today. But if we only know the Du Bois of empiricism, which was phenomenal empiricism way ahead of its time, and I'm not knocking it, then we don't get that Du Bois. It's theoretically really powerful and useful. And you're right that the anti-communist is part of why I think some people have only rehabilitated parts of Du Bois, but we have to be honest that a lot of his best theoretical arguments are really strongly anti-colonial and strongly about class as much as about race. And the one caveat there is, I wish I could also say it was strongly about gender, but it's not.
Just a quick thought. You have to kind of contextualize his view based upon his life. He lived to be 95. You can imagine what he saw in those 95 years that his views changed. The struggles that he saw early on, the continuing struggles, and the reception he received when he went overseas and saw all these other countries embracing him. Why wouldn't he embrace some of these radical ideas and views from, places that respected him? So I think, yes, you have to do that. I mean, in my book, I have a whole chapter on sort of, his FBI file that was basically based upon the beliefs, his radical beliefs and looking into him. So you cannot talk about him without talking about that, but that certainly doesn't totally define who he was throughout his 95 years of life. So,
Last question, and then we'll have a quick wrap up by President Maruna.
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you for even having this panel. I'm trying not to geek out too much, having all of you up here. My name is Talib Hudson. I'm Director of Research at the National Network for Safe Communities at John Jay, and also the founder of an emerging community-based think tank called the New Hood at the New School, where I got my doctorate in public policy last year. I'm a bit embarrassed because my dissertation, which is on community-based violence prevention and evidence-based policy, heavily cited Du Bois. I thought I was doing something special, but I didn't read the whole Philadelphia Negro, I admit. And I did rely a lot on Sean McKay, because that's just where the gravity of the literature has been. And I'm just realizing now even how much I'd been, beholden to that. So I'm wondering if you can comment on, if we assume that Du Bois already said something about that as it relates to all social sciences, what might Du Bois say, or what might be a Du Boisian perspective on contemporary public policy as it relates to crime and violence, particularly in urban Black neighborhoods? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm buying time for myself because that's such a big question. And I mean, I'm also thinking about, my dissertation is looking at how people are talking about from, the backlash to all the George Floyd protests and people calling for more crime and incarceration to people calling for the full abolition of policing and prisons. And I feel like based on the question that we just talked about, I feel like there's a good chance that Du Bois at the end of his career would probably be an abolitionist. Given abolition democracy was a concept that started with Du Bois. And, we can get into the specifics at another time of like exactly what he meant versus what abolitionists today are talking about. But yeah, I guess maybe I'll just start the conversation there and kind of mull it over a little bit more of, I think that a criminology and I think a discussion of the current state of crime and justice, even if you are not an abolitionist, has to include consideration of those viewpoints. and the people today who, again, I think, like I said, outside the academy are working in a Du Boisian tradition, who are, going to that particular end of the spectrum and thinking about what a world without institutions that are designed to oppress Black and brown Americans could look like.
As Shad Maruna closes us out, I'd like to thank each and every one of the panel members.
What a great panel, what great questions. Thank you, everybody, for participating, for staying with us. I know you got to run to the next session, but something that Sean said at the very end made me remember. I'm so scattered, I forgot to say at the beginning. And this is a perfect opportunity to announce, although we're slightly premature, Catherine has proposed a new award for criminology for the ASC to be named the W.E.B. Du Bois Award for scholarship that is in the Du Boisian tradition, I'm happy to announce we got through the first hurdle of the executive board vote. We had a unanimous vote in favor of the proposal by the board on Tuesday, one more vote on Saturday, and then it becomes a reality, and that's all thanks to her and thanks to all of you in supporting Du Bois. Thanks very much for coming.